Hi there and welcome to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew, on Dublin City FM 103.2. Each week we have an expert from the world of business sharing their knowledge, insights and tips to help you reduce costs, increase profits and drive efficiencies. If there's a topic that you'd like covered, or if you feel that you can make a contribution, please email me at yourbusiness@dublincityfm.ie and perhaps we'll be chatting here one day soon. Today's guest is Managing Director of Behan Dispute Resolutions, who specialise in resolving commercial and domestic disputes of all sizes. He's a board member and director of ISME. He's also a board member and director of St Michael's House Housing Association. And he's a past president of a worldwide body called the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. I'm delighted to welcome Joe Behan to the You and Your Business studio. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Alec. It's good to be here.
Great. I'm fascinated by the whole world that you're in. You must constantly find yourself nearly having disputes all of the time. And I know there's 4 areas, so I'm going to take them through because we had a quick chat before the show. And we'll do them in reverse order, but just the ones that, just so people, our audience can get an understanding of what the different types are. There's conciliation, adjudication, arbitration and mediation. Just give me a couple of words on conciliation and what that's all about.
Okay. Well, conciliation is a process where it's not an adjudicative process. It's where people in the construction industry, and it's mostly construction based, people come together to have their disputes resolved. Partly, the first part of it is through mediation. The second part is maybe through a decision-making recommendation, but it's not binding. So it's a hybrid process of kind of mediation and kind of adjudication.
But it's mainly related to the construction.
Related to construction and generally construction only. It's in every single construction contract.
Okay. And adjudication then?
Adjudication, again, there are two different types of adjudication. It is, as it says, it's an adjudicative process. The two areas that it happens in is, again, in construction, where there's a law in place, the Construction Contracts Act, and also in employment law, there's adjudication in that area. And again, both of them they're binding until not accepted. Yeah. So they're adjudicative processes. It's about the third party making a decision. All right.
Let's get into the meaty stuff, though. Let's talk a bit about arbitration, and then we can get on to mediation, which is the really meaty piece. But let's just talk about arbitration for a minute. Explain arbitration and how that it is related to people in their everyday lives.
Well, people would generally be familiar with the process of court, which is a public forum.
I hope not.
They'd be familiar with it from maybe the television. And they might watch Judge Judy in this time.
Right, okay.
But arbitration is a private mechanism, and it's in a way similar to the High Court or any higher court, where people require a decision, and a decision is made by an arbitrator.
Right.
The person in the middle is the arbitrator. Arbitration is contained, the provision for arbitration is contained in all sorts of different types of contracts, such as the purchase of property. So if you buy a house and a dispute arises within that, it's resolved through arbitration, which is a private mechanism. But mostly it's used in construction.
So you're involved in arbitration?
Yes.
Can you give us an example of maybe something you worked on? I know confidentiality is very important, so we won't obviously be talking names or companies and things like that, but have you some sort of an example of that and how you were involved or how you got brought into it and how the process then went through?
Well, the very first arbitration I did was on the purchase of a car.
All right.
And used to be, not necessarily now, but every car that was bought in the country was subject to the contract contained a clause for arbitration.
Oh, right.
So if you found yourself buying a car which had a problem, the only place you could really get it resolved was in an arbitration.
Oh.
And in the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, we used to use these arbitrations. We had an arrangement with SIMI.
Right.
And so all
That's
our
the
members...
Society of the Irish Motor Industry.
Yeah, all our members started their arbitrating in car disputes. So that was my very first arbitration, was in relation to a defective car.
Right.
And it was a great learning process, but it was essentially about somebody who'd bought a car, wasn't happy, and the dealer didn't accept the dispute as being valid, wouldn't give them their money back or repair the car. So a decision had to be made, and I made it as an arbitrator. And it's binding. Arbitration is binding.
So
There's
that's
very, very little way of actually getting past a decision.
So in other words, both parties enter into this particular way of doing of arbitration. Both parties enter into arbitration on the understanding that somebody will make a decision that is binding on both of them.
It's a binding decision by an independent third party, and it's backed. There's an Arbitration Act, so it's all backed by legislation.
So, is there a way they might challenge it in any way? Could they go to court?
Very little. There used to be a lot of ways with the old Arbitration Act, but the new Arbitration Act, there is very little, if any, provision for challenging a decision.
Right. And particularly where there's a situation where arbitration is available, I would presume that the courts would be very reluctant to, if you approach the courts before getting involved in arbitration, they would possibly frown upon it.
The courts are very, very supportive of arbitration. In fact, there's a judge who deals with arbitration, and it is very seldom that decisions will be challenged, and then those that are challenged, there are very, very few that ever have a successful outcome, because the judiciary is hugely supportive of the process. They don't want to get involved in it because it's a separate process.
Yeah, so typically, I mean, I have seen some of Judge Judy, and often there are people who are quite discommoded by the outcome of the result, but it's generally based on law, so there's a way of assessing a particular case, and Correct. The fact that it doesn't fall in your favour is not due to any partiality on behalf of the person who's adjudicating it. It's the rule of law, really.
And what you have, similar to, as I said to you earlier, like some of these actions are like High Court actions, where you'll have senior and junior counsel on each side, full legal teams, you'll have experts. You could have, the longest one I ever had was a 14-day hearing.
Wow.
So they can be quite long processes, and they can involve major sums of money. You're talking, sometimes the biggest one I had was 70 million. So these are not, in construction, these disputes can be quite large. Right.
And this would be under arbitration and things like that.
Correct.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I suppose let's get into the real meat of it, though, because this is the bread and butter of the business. And also, I think our listeners will be well familiar with various cases and things that happen in real life and they read in the newspapers. And just if you're just joining us now, you're listening to me, Alec Drew, on Dublin City FM 103.2, where my studio guest is Joe Behan of Behan Dispute Resolutions, sharing his knowledge on the whole subject of mediation. We're just about to talk about mediation. Explain that to me. What's that to people in their everyday life, and how does that work, both either on a domestic or in a business setting?
Well, mediation is a non-adjudicative process, which means that there's no decision-making involved.
Right.
So when I sit as a mediator, my job is to bring the people together to help them come to a decision between themselves.
Right.
So they formulate, it's their process, it's their outcome, and it's their agreement. So they take ownership of the dispute, and they take ownership of managing it and bring it to a conclusion. So the onus is away from me onto them, effectively. I help and facilitate them to come to that situation where they can reach an agreement, because when people are in dispute, they're often in a very difficult place. And a third-party intervention can be very good for them to help them through this maze of difficulty.
Somebody who's non-biased. Who would bring you in the first place? Is it one of the parties would contact you to bring you in?
It would be either one of the parties or one of the parties' lawyers who would bring me in. Mostly it would be their lawyers who would ask me, would I be available? The first question is, do you know either side? Have you had any dealings with either side? Do you feel conflicted in any way? And you have to be very open and upfront and say, even if you have a social connection with somebody, it's about perceived bias. You can't have perceived bias.
All right.
So that's the first stage, is to get a call. But I'll often get calls from people in the domestic situation saying, I'm splitting up with my partner, husband, wife, and I'd like if you could help with the process and mediate. Would you mind calling the other side?
Right.
Which I don't.
Which you don't.
Yeah.
Would that potentially be seen sometime down in the role of the negotiations, or where you're talking through, oh, hang on a sec, you brought Joe Behan in,
Correct.
And which now presents a problem in
Correct.
itself?
Well, you have to put yourself in this situation. What if you got a phone call from somebody saying, hi, your partner rang me, and I would you come to a meeting about your splitting up? It wouldn't endear you particularly. And I think it really needs to come from within, and that's the process, is that it is within. So it's within the couple, or in commercial thing, it's within, between the companies. It's about them, it's not about me in mediation. It's not about decision making.
How quickly are the legal world likely to bring you into a situation? Do they try themselves to resolve these particular issues? And even do they have the skills to do it? Because I suppose through the course of business I've seen an action started by one party that once a solicitor's letter is generated, it means one from the far side is going to come back fairly smartly, and then you're into a tit-for-tat situation.
Indeed. Well, I've been involved in mediation probably for close on 20 years, I suppose. And in that time, I've seen a huge change. It used to be always said that mediation was a good idea, and it always will be. Yeah. But I think the legal profession has dramatically changed its attitude to it. A whole series of people, either barristers or solicitors, have trained up as mediators.
All right.
Judges have trained up. Some retired judges are now acting as mediators.
Right.
So the legal profession have embraced it to a large extent, and it's used hugely now where it used to be. And there's also a mediation act in place, and effectively there can be cost penalties if you don't engage. So if somebody says to you, Alec, you have to consider mediation here, and you say, no, I don't.
Right.
Well, even if you win the case, it could be that you lose on costs.
Right,
because
which could be quite
haven't
substantial.
Given consideration to mediating.
So if we understand mediation then, so somebody like yourself who's a neutral, who's non-biased, is brought into a particular situation, either domestically or in the corporate world. We'll talk about domestic in a minute, because that's always interesting, and we're all nosy people anyway. But and so therefore people lay their case down. How does that happen? How do you engage with the parties to then, before you bring them together? I presume there's some sort of meeting up and you've some questions to ask and things like that.
I particularly like to have pre-mediation meetings with people.
Right.
And I like to meet them, particularly in the commercial field. I like to meet them on their own ground, individually.
Right.
Because people are much more relaxed on their own ground. They're much more open, and you get a better sense of what the whole thing is about when you actually go and meet them. I will always ask for submissions, written submissions, but very succinct, one-page wonders. I don't want to have a caseload or a box sent to me. Not that it doesn't happen, but I really don't want all the papers associated with a case. And you ask the question, when do I become involved? So it can be either in the commercial, where parties are in court, the case is ongoing.
All right, so they've got that far with it.
Yeah, and maybe a judge will suggest that they give consideration to mediation. The judges now have the power to do that.
Right.
So they will head off, and you don't kind of refuse a judge's suggestion. And alternatively, they will try to bring the mediation in before the expensive sections start occurring in litigation,
Right.
such as discovery and stuff like that, which can be hugely expensive. So they try to get the mediation happening at that stage before it gets into court.
I can't see our legal eagles being too happy with all of that.
No, I think it would be unfair to say that. But certainly there are different times when it's judicious to mediate.
All right.
And
So-
there are wrong times to mediate.
No, okay. So we've now found ourselves in a situation. So
Yeah.
you've met both parties.
Yeah.
We've taken their one-page summary. Let's call it that.
Yeah.
So you have their sort of wish list of the outcomes of
Yeah.
what is expected. I'm sure you see some very divergent lists in terms of and you're sitting in the middle of it.
Well, it's always going to be one side's black and one side's white, and everybody is right. So it's a matter of, I won't say how do you get through that, but if you take, for example, a car accident,
Yes.
the light's always green for both.
Yes, of course it is. Yes.
And it's the same with disputes. The other side are always wrong and you're always right. So the way that mediation works is to get the people together. Because oftentimes what they haven't done is listened. They haven't heard each other. They've got paperwork.
Right.
They never actually heard what the other side have to say. So getting people into the same room can be quite difficult sometimes. And that's where the business gets done effectively, where people can hear each other, listen to what the other side have to say and actually actively listen to it. It does change the dynamic. It changes people's perception. It's one thing reading.
Yes, of course. It's very cold reading something.
Very
yes.
cold. And it's always, it's high level anger in a sense. So you read very bad stuff about yourself.
Yes, of course.
Coming, and that's not nice. So when somebody's sitting across the table from you, it's very different.
I'd say it is.
And that's where the good work gets done in mediation, for me, where I get people engaging. If they engage, they will move their positions.
So that's the first thing is to get them into that room.
Get them into the room.
with a person who is not biased in any way.
Correct.
And can sit neutrally there and ask questions in a way that manages any sort of emotions that are in the room.
And also to allow emotions to be free, so that people can, I have to manage the situation. So people are very vocal sometimes,
Sure.
extremely vocal. So you have to accept that and allow it to happen. Obviously, not to the extent where they start to punch each other. You have to allow that to be released, and only when that's released, really, I find that that's very cathartic. But then it's also my job to develop options, generate options for people that they may not even have thought as ways of resolving.
Right, and
But also to reality check. So, their arguments have to be checked for reality, and you got to be very honest with them.
Speaking of punch-ups, have you ever been involved or seen any of this sort of carry-on? I'm sure it's more common than we'd like to think.
Well, there's a friend of mine in Texas, and he's a sign on his door, a mediator, and it says, "Please leave your guns outside." But I don't think we're at that stage here. I had one situation, which I call the will, where there were a family became involved with each other, meeting to distribute certain assets after the mother had died, and unfortunately it became physical.
Wow.
By accident more than anything else, but a lot of history came out, and they were brought down to the four courts eventually and charged with assault.
Oh, wow.
And the judge, happily enough, even though she hadn't got the power, suggested that they should go away and try and mediate the dispute.
Right.
Which they did. I got a call to meet the family. There were four of them, and so that was a punch-up that developed into a mediation.
Right.
But it got resolved, even though it was extremely tense. They were refusing to meet each other in the same space. They'd rather go to jail, etc., etc. So it was very volatile, very, very emotional. But it was resolved because we managed to get them into the room together. It got resolved in 3 hours.
And there was sort of an outpouring of emotions, and people...
There was a lot of emotion.
I'd say there was.
But there was no physical emotion.
Oh, that's great to hear.
I didn't want to repeat.
Okay, if you're out there, if you're just joining us, you're listening to me, Alec Drew, on Dublin City 103.2 FM, where in my studio, the You and Your Business Studios, Joe Behan of Behan Dispute Resolutions, and we're talking about mediation. Tell me, Joe, in terms of... I often hear that people, mediation is sort of, they find themselves in it because something's happened. Is there a way to mitigate against that? Like, for example, I'm often thinking of planning your future, wills, succession planning. Where does mediation fit into that? Because I don't think people tend to think of that too much.
Well, mediation is a kind of a broad stroke, and particularly in family business situations, which this country is built on.
Yes, of course.
And you have situations where, let's say, maybe it's the father and mother, or maybe the father or the mother who are the main owner, with children, and they need to look to the future. They often try to do it themselves,
right?
And it can lead to an awful lot of friction. Or they don't actually deal with it, which leads even to more friction because people don't know what the future holds for them. They can't plan. And bringing in a third party into that situation can be very useful because the third party becomes the focus rather than that they each become the focus. And it allows them a safe space where they can discuss the future and where they can come to decisions about the future, affecting both the business and obviously there are a lot of maybe assets as well, and also the children could have their own children, so this is generational.
All right.
And if you have a situation where a dispute arises between the mother and father and the children, or whatever combination of that, and it's not resolved, it becomes generational. It goes right down through the generations.
So you've got sons and daughter-in-laws and son-in-laws, and they all get...
And grandchildren, and then that continues indefinitely. So I think it's very good planning, business planning, to develop a strategy for the future to bring in a third party. You mentioned the word mediation. Sometimes that's probably not the right description to use. It is, in a sense, a hybrid.
Yeah. It's kind of more a facilitation type process
of discussion. Yeah. And I think I have one at the moment with father and 3 daughters. It's a very difficult situation. Very successful business, lots of assets.
Right.
And so it's important when you have a third party who can be deflecting away the emotion from within the group. When you have these meetings without third parties, it can become very personalised, and also you can people bring in history.
All right.
So do you remember when you were 5 and you robbed my train set?
Right. Yes.
Stole my Lego.
It gets personal.
And here you are now trying to steal the company. So this people bring in a lot of history into these situations.
It's amazing. There's a lot of pent-up emotion in people, and we don't get to see it until the situation presents itself. Yeah. And I suppose it might be the case that somebody who is the head of a family, in the succession planning would think, well, I'll sit them all down, tell them how it's going to be, and present it as a fait accompli, and so then the fireworks go off.
Yeah. And none of them are trained to actively listen, so it becomes like, I suppose, one of those shows, late night TV, political shows, where everybody shouts at each other and nobody actually hears a thing.
Yes, of course.
But bringing in a third party can help that hugely. I think it's very important in those family businesses to have that. And you talked about not only resolving, do you put out the fire or do you prevent the fire?
Sure.
So, in family business disputes, trying to put out the fire is not easy. And at that stage, there's a lot of stuff has gone under the bridge, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of difficulty. And I think putting in place preventative dispute avoidance mechanisms if you want to call them that, is a much better way of dealing with it. Although it's hard for people sometimes to accept that they want to have to spend money to prevent something.
Well, it's called insurance in the world out there. None of us want to pay insurance premiums, but we're always glad we have when there's a problem. Where can they find more information about this?
Well, my website is disputeresolution.ie.
Right.
And they can contact me through the website.
Disputeresolutions.ie. Would you like to give me, just with the couple of minutes we've left here, maybe a couple of quickies around mediation, a couple of stories? I know you mentioned one where it was much nicer when there was a lot of assets involved in the split up of a couple we were talking about.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Had a mediation with a couple, a very successful business couple, and they had quite an inordinate amount of assets.
Right.
But their relationship had broken down and they needed it to be finalised formally without necessarily going through the court, because that's not really where they wanted to go. Now, it's easy when there are quite a number of assets to say, you have the house in Portugal and I'll take the one in France.
Yes, of course.
Which is not true for most people that I would.
Yes, unfortunately.
But even with that, and being able to trade different things and say, you can have this and you can have that and I'll have this now, it always will come down to a core where they won't necessarily want to trade. And some parts end up in court where there may be shares in the company which one party has all, and they're not particularly willing to give them up to the other.
So, I mean,
it
in
can
terms
be
of
very difficult.
Yeah. So what we're saying here is, in terms of mediation, what you'd like to think is that if the case is presented reasonably by a non-biased person, that people can see what's being said, listen clearly to what's being said, and see the value of getting an agreement. Because the only other place after all of this ends up in the court, where a judge will make a decision, and that will be the final decision made.
Absolutely, and who really wants other people making decisions for them? And I think that's the beauty of mediation, is that it's about you making decisions for yourself and taking ownership of the dispute and resolving it to an agreement yourself, rather than somebody saying, you have that, and you don't really like the outcome.
It must be one of those cases, because you often find that when you have a situation where you have two parties who disagree, and you bring them together, both of them must take a dislike to you, because they have never seen, because they see you there as the bad person.
Sitting on the wall sometimes can be sore, but yeah, I mean, I'm the middle party and I'm the scapegoat. But I have to recognise that's my role, that's my job.
Well, guess what? It's been a real pleasure, Joe, talking to you. I think it's a fascinating subject. It's the website again, if you'd like to just share it with the audience.
Disputeresolution.ie.
Joe Behan, I must say, delighted to have you and your business. That's all we have time for today. Welcome again, Joe Behan, for coming into the You and Your Business studio. Thanks to Darren on sound. Don't forget that you can contact the show by emailing yourbusiness@dublincityfm.ie with your comments and suggestions. Don't forget that you can contact the show by emailing yourbusiness@dublincityfm. The podcast of today's show will be available on dublincityfm.ie from tomorrow. Thank you for your company, and please remember to join me, Alec Drew, again next week at the same time, 12:30, right here on 103.2 FM for another edition of You and Your Business.